I've been looking forward to play each of the Halo games so far as they come up in the series, but none have piqued my curiosity quite like ODST. My memory of it is something very different, especially when we consider what we've experienced up to this point so far. The way I've heard others talk about it up to this point has certainly done the job of elevating it as well. If I think back to my time with the Halo series, it really has had the highest highs, along with parts that just do not quite work so well, especially in a retrospective context. So when taking ODST into consideration, I was curious to see how it fitted in. So join me today on a quick critical look back at Halo ODST. All footage you can see in the background is taken from some of my favourite moments from the game. Bungie at this stage seem to have found a dual story to be their best mode of operation. The main Halo franchise uses a sci-fi backdrop for a more standard military adventure. ODST instead takes a noir detective story and combines it again with a military adventure, with a sprinkling of sci-fi and cyberpunk throughout. You follow the Rookie, a character who is so called the strong and silent type, to the point of not saying a word throughout the campaign. We are also joined by a cast of more conversational characters, starring some recognisable faces from the Firefly cast. You know, Nathan Fillion, Adam Baldwin and Alan Tudyk. It's an interesting choice, and one I get why it was made. There's a lot of cultural cachet with the nerds of the time, but I don't necessarily think it's too additive to the experience as a whole. It also doesn't take away from it. We can also make a mark on our tracker of celebrities being featured in games up to this point. You and your team are dropping onto the city of New Mombasa, and you're scattered to the wind. It's your job as the Rookie to go from piece of evidence to piece of evidence of your team to try and figure out what's been going in the interim moments when you were not conscious. You were knocked out during the drop. This is a noir story that's fleshed out with an incredibly jazzy soundtrack, complete with outrageous saxophone, that creates and heightens this atmosphere that stitches together these moments during the night time of New Mombasa. There was a moment that I could see 2 enemy phantom dropships circling a building in the distance. I just sat there, tense, waiting for something to happen. My objective was just lying on the floor next to me. I'd completely missed it. My sense of the world and the tension throughout meant something could happen, even if it didn't. Wandering around New Mombasa brings moments like this. The city is dead, apart from patrolling Covenant forces. But this is no bad thing. It brings a sense to a place that used to be very recently lived in. An eerie lack of life, streets that should have been busy, cars abandoned on the side. And this is a Halo game we're talking about here. But Halo's never really had a problem with tone. Whenever it marries together the music with a moment to moment, it tends to hit this really high note. Whether we're talking about the Gregorian chanting with what I assume is violin, or the more smoky vibes found in ODST, finding an atmospheric tone to go with the game has never really been its issue. It's usually the storytelling itself that I have a problem with, and unfortunately that problem remains here. The method of story being delivered, finding these various items in New Mombasa, and then being transported to a flashback with your team is great, for a key reason I'll get into in a second. The actual moment to moment that happens in these flashbacks is still full of narrative beats that we've heard before. The bell of cliche rings, whether it's a tense romantic relationship at the heart of the story, which of course ends up with the couple getting together, or your fellow soldier being injured and fighting through it. These are beats we've seen before, and they fall into line of your expectations in a war story. A certain amount of craftsmanship can tell a story that's predictable and interesting, but this is predictable and not interesting. But the key reason why these flashbacks are good? Well, with these aspects of the story being separated off, we get a story that can legitimately exist in 2 parts. When I'm playing as the Rookie, the game is giving me great vibes for days. When I go into one of these various teammate flashbacks, I know I'm getting the exaggerated over-the-top military story that's always existed in these games. And even though these components can seem disparate and opposites, they don't fight each other when they're situated like this. In fact, they actually complement each other in a lot of ways, both in the sense of pacing and what you're doing in these missions. You go from the slower, stalking around of New Mombasa all alone, to these more heightened military situations. Speaking of these moments that you are stalking around New Mombasa, they are yet another argument made by these parts of the Halo series to them being open world games. You essentially can explore the city to your leisure, with it opening up more and more as you progress through. Now mechanically there is barely anything here, but even this slight nod to openness breaks open the gameplay. Things like seeing a patrol ahead has a different dynamic now. You can sneak around, you do not have to fight every battle. There was this one point when I was moving through the city and I saw 2 hunters, and I just thought nope, and chose a different path forward. The story as presented to you in the game has its usual good sci-fi underpinnings. There's a moment when you find piles of dead elites that your character questions, which we of course know has to do with the insurrection completed by the brutes in Halo 2. The main plot itself is your team being on a covert mission to rescue the computer system that powers the city, along with these engineer-type aliens being found throughout the city. We later discover that these are basically bio-supercomputers that are floating around and boosting the brute shields. One has got into the city's core and is controlling it, as well as having a good amount of data of both sides of the conflict, meaning that we want to extract it. This is all elaborated on with audio logs spread throughout the city, telling the story of Sadie. I thought I had about a third of them when I finished, but checking, I actually only had 10%. I had 3 of them. Modern games have developed a language to signal to you different aspects of open worlds that might be interesting for you to go and explore, and these are just not quite here. It's an older game, so I wouldn't say this is too much of an issue, but it did mean I didn't have what is a really interesting part of this game signaled to me. It's also frustrating from the perspective that the theme of being a noir detective is reinforced if we're picking up this separate story about the city. Sadie's story itself cuts through some of the hoorah military mindset and is much more of a cyberpunk narrative about the end of the world. Sadie is a character who is clearly full of the fight to do the right thing, and can be seen joining the military to go and fight the Covenant. She's being slowed down by the city itself. The superintendent is built from an AI that used to babysit her, both designed by her father. The story asks the question of whether having one centralised AI running the city is a good thing, and sees the potential of how this could get corrupted by coexisting with other power structures, namely the horrible chief of police. I'm not sure how I feel about this character. Locating his need to expand his own personal renown I think is good framing, but having him move to sexually assault Sadie very quickly in the story is never quite given any weight. It's brushed over for shock value. There are a lot of other components of this story that build together. It's just this early introduction that signals this character's evil that never quite sits right with me. I actually listened to the story on YouTube completely separately. I mention this because I've already admitted to not getting all of the audio logs. The story itself has this interesting quirk to it, where each of the pieces run into each other a fair amount. Each section you're picking up begins with the end of the last section. And I point it out just because it's interesting to think how creating a separate narrative within a game has certain limitations. The developer can't guarantee how long it has been since you heard your last bit of story, so wants to recap. It's also true that the story segments themselves aren't particularly long because they need to fit within the game. You try and write a story that fits into a couple of minute sections that constantly needs to be recapping itself and see how it turns out. That's to say, within this framework I quite like Sadie's stories overall. One of the topics of the Halo games that we've frequently talked about are the combat sections, and there are a couple of things I want to highlight as differences in this game. There are a couple of new weapons that are designed with the covert nature of your mission, a silenced submachine gun and a pistol. That's to say, stealth isn't really a big aspect of this game, they're more an aesthetic thing. You can't dual wield any longer in this game, which I tried to make sense of by the fact you're no longer playing a super soldier. And this really would be my big point of interest, if it actually brought more to the mechanics at all. You essentially have the same shields and then the same health as Halo 1. They are just called slightly different names, but they do the same functional job in the world. You can rip turrets off their mounts again. You still play the same sort of soldier. It's just the theming has changed. Your characters grunt more, they seem like they're hurting more, but we're still fighting in the same way with the same methods as before. I even remembered to play the game on heroic this time. There is one key point that I do want to mention that I did notice whilst playing this game, and I think it's a core part of what makes Halo's combat design good. It's how the enemies wield weapons. You see pretty much all the enemies in Halo wielding all of the guns, or at least all types of the guns, with a couple of exceptions. Brutes tend to be the only ones with gravity hammers, and snipers tend to go to the jackals. But what I mean is big cannons, things like that can be held by anything from grunts all the way up to brutes. And the reason this is important? Well, taking down any singular enemy in a crowd is useful. In fact, it's necessary on harder difficulties. Just removing a part of the incoming fire is good. So thinning the crowd, whilst using these different tactics against different enemies, the classic shoot the shield of the jackal to break it and then hit the head when it recoils, creates a game about managing the battlefield in front of you. So we've had a conversation about how the combat fits within this game design. It's the same, and that goes for the usual set pieces as well. I also do want to mention the location of New Mombasa itself. Street fighting is not really a common occurrence in Halo up to this stage, even if the fighting has taken place in corridor type structures. I don't have loads to say on this, there's just moments in tight corridors that feel nothing like the rest of the series whatsoever, and it's interesting to see that the world design affects the combat encounters. All of this comes together into a game that's an interesting inflection compared to the rest of the series. It uses its opportunity of not being a main series to follow up and expand out what it can do, experiments with storytelling method, for this series anyway, and takes a chance on a completely different tone, one that has mesmerised myself and other players who've played this game to this day. I'm sure this track is still on regular use on people's playlists, and it has been in mine over the last few weeks. It just doesn't do away with enough, or at least understand enough about its whole self for me. Whenever the Halo series falls into the mode of storytelling that hits the beats because they should happen, rather than designing characters with a drop of depth, the game begins to have a crack in its armour. Perhaps I'm expecting too much from an older game, but I think it's true for the series up to this point. I think back to Halo 1 and one of my biggest compliments being it knew when to tell story and when to let the game do the speaking. Bungie during this era are much better at the latter. The skyboxes, the atmosphere and the world all do so much for the series. They work incredibly well to this day, but the layering of poor characters onto this is an additive. This becomes interesting when you take Sadie's story into consideration as well. It's situated somewhere amongst this. I just looked this up as I wanted to be sure, but it was made externally to Bungie at the time. And you can kind of tell the type of story, the characterization and the development of these characters is very un-Bungie. As a little side note, interestingly, it was written by the same people involved with 42 Entertainment, known for their ARGs like I Love Bees that announced Halo 2, and Last Chance Poker from Gun, recently covered on this channel. This story, even with sections that make me go ooh, manages to bring so much more human to the world of Halo than what's transpired so far. Notice that I haven't mentioned combat in my conclusion up to this point. When we get to this stage in a series, it becomes easy to take it for granted, but it's still really good. I still really enjoy the style of combat in these games. As the series goes on, the appreciation only grows really. It's not revelatory any longer, but it works well. Really, really well. I do think it's a missed opportunity that they didn't use its change of setting and characters to mechanically produce a different feeling rather than just playing as the Master Chief. Helps it's still fun to play though. Right, that takes us up to Halo Reach to be done in these critical look backs. Yes, there's been a name change from retrospective. Yes, I reserve the right to change the names of the things I do until I'm happy with them. Yes, I'm constantly thinking about names of things. Reach is a game I remember playing the most, and I remember the driving factor for me being the story. So let's see how Bungie's notoriously complicated relationship with storytelling, let's say, holds up 12 years later. Thank you for watching. My name has been Billy. Goodbye.